All right. Well, thanks to each of you again for participating in this diversity, equity, and inclusion roundtable we have planned at MiBiz panel. You can see their names there in the corner, but we have Guillermo Cisneros, Executive Director of the West Michigan Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, Sandra Gaddy, who's the CEO of the Women's Resource Center, Tanya Gibbs, managing partner at Rosette Law Firm, a majority Native American owned national law firm. Bing Goy, president of Eastern Floral and board member of the West Michigan Asian American Association, and as well as the Asian Pacific American Chamber of Commerce. And Jeffrey Sorensen, who's director of Out on the Lakeshore, an LGBTQ resource center based over in Holland. So the topic today is diversity, equity, inclusion, and particularly timely given the events of the past 6 months. So I guess I'd like to start there and have you, just each of you, talk about how your work and how your organizations have sort of been shaped, or if sort of your missions were kind of reinforced over the past 6 months, and how the pandemic, as well as some of the social justice movements going on, have sort of amplified what are inequities that you're sort of trying to resolve through your organization. So I guess we'll start in alphabetical order. Guillermo, do you want to get started?
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Andy, for the opportunity to be here with MiBiz, and a part of this panel. It definitely, COVID-19 has brought, a lot of uncertainty, not just for organizations, but for our communities of color. Since the beginning of COVID, we were doing everything, in person, and before COVID, I would say we're doing, we're having our signature events, and we were connecting, monthly with Latinx businesses, with our members. And since COVID started, we have had to switch, to a virtual environment. We started working remotely,
Hey, Guillermo, you're starting to cut in and out. I don't know if that's on our part or it's on your part.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, but you're cutting in and out, so the connections might be somewhat
yeah,
challenged.
I don't know. Maybe it's the mic.
Yeah.
Let me know if I continue to cut in and out.
It was okay on my end, so.
It was okay on your end?
Yep.
Okay. So so we have pretty much had to transition to virtual environments, and what we realized is that a high percentage of our community, or the people that we were communicating with, didn't have the technological infrastructure, to connect. So, and this is one of the points that I'm going to share, more, and so it has been a challenge, but, we have been able to, to establish, different channels. We have increased the productivity in the team, the West Michigan Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. We started to put together more webinars, more workshops, and the participation has increased, through the virtual space. So it has definitely, been interesting, how we have switched, and adopted a different model. But, definitely within our Latinx business community, it has shut down many businesses that were starting to produce and to be successful in the area. The Latinx community has been on the front lines, in the last 6 months in the manufacturing, in agriculture, and other industries. Unfortunately, the cases of infections increased significantly, and this has had a negative impact, not just in the Latinx businesses, but also has affected the morale of the Latinx community. We have seen many cases of anxiety, high stress, and depression among our Latinx business owners. Since a high percentage of Latinx businesses have closed and many individuals in our community have been infected, the income of businesses and families has decreased significantly in the last 6 months, making our community even more vulnerable, than it was before. Mm-hmm. And the last point that I wanted to share with this panel about, the impact of COVID, COVID really has exposed the lack of resources and infrastructure we have in our communities of color. In regard to technology, access to internet, the West Michigan community doesn't have an infrastructure that allows fluid communication with the most vulnerable neighborhoods. During the beginning of the pandemic, as I mentioned, we were trying to communicate with several individuals, and we found out that many of them didn't have laptops, and the cell phone plans, wouldn't allow to talk for more than a certain amount of minutes. We were doing this survey that the City of Grand Rapids and organizations, got together, to ask the community how they were doing, how they were feeling, and we couldn't stay with them for more than 20 minutes, which was the length of the survey, because of, the lack, of available, cell phone plans, for them, we will get caught at, and so it was very challenging. Really the communication was broken within our community, with our community. So that's one of the most important pieces that we continue to share with the mayor of the city, with the Kent County commissioners, that we need a better technological infrastructure, in our neighborhoods of color.
Sure. Okay, great. Sandra, you and I talked about a month ago or so, but do you want to share what your experience has been during this time at the Women's Resource Center?
Sure. Women's Resource Center, well, our primary responsibility and purpose is really assuring women have purpose, financial stability, and fulfillment in their employment. And so this is a workforce development agency serving the needs of women in our community, and us knowing, and I don't know if everyone knows that across the US, how much this pandemic has affected women. They are the highest number of women that have, people who have been affected in the demographic, and that is the same for within our community. So we have not only assisted women just experiencing job loss, but also women re-entering the community from jail, in prison as well, but mostly jail through our program at Kent County Corrections called New Beginnings. We've also experienced we continue to experience women who are in crisis, and that's crisis coming from evictions, crisis coming from not only job loss or movement into a part-time hours or even less than they've anticipated. So they're having a hard time making ends meet. As a number of, that is the story that we're hearing for so many families and individuals across our community, and just frankly across the state and the country. So, but being able to assist the women that we're serving during this crisis by also helping them find work. Some of it may not be as meaningful as they hope, but they are, as I said, trying to make ends meet and trying to take care of their children. But here's the another large piece to that puzzle is that they're also trying to school their children at home. I won't call it homeschool because many of the women we're serving, they say, I don't homeschool, but they're working through school with their children. And if they don't have jobs and they don't have, they have an additional barrier of transportation, trying to fit within its hybrid model is very difficult. Also being fearful of even taking their children to school, that's very difficult for them, and trying to find work while not having access to childcare and having access to food weekly. And we have great partnerships with a number of shelters, and not just shelters, but food agencies that are helping with those insecurities there. But still, there's just the common things that we all have is the cleaning supplies, the care goods and things like that, that these families still need. And being able to assist them through the crisis, as well as providing the necessary work for them, because people in our community, they want to work, and that's challenging. It is very challenging, but we are continuing to, our team, our coaches are working really hard, as well as our volunteers. Most of what we do is right now is virtual, but we are in offices, and we do have some women coming in and just providing some of those services that we have continued to have provided in the past, but also doing probably 75% of the work that we're doing is virtual.
I see. Okay. Great. Tanya, I think you're up next. Do you want to, talk about some of the issues you've been sort of confronting at your firm during this time?
Sure. Well, the strangest thing for me personally is just not traveling since March. Just by the nature of the practice that we have, we represent Indian tribes all over the country, and rather than having clients come to our office, we go to the reservation. So I live my life on an airplane and have a mobile office, which made me well suited to transition to work from home fairly easily. But it certainly is different to not have that face-to-face communication with the clients. And as Indian people, I think that's really important to us. We're sort of all one big family in a lot of ways. And so to not be able to spend that extra time with folks is a little bit difficult. But I mean, certainly COVID has had a massive impact on Indian country, both from a healthcare standpoint. I mean, as many of you know, communities of color are often more affected by these health issues than others. We've seen the Navajo Nation, for example. I think numbers the other day, they are upwards of 10,000 deaths just within Navajo itself, which is just crazy to me. But it's really been a wide variety of experiences for tribes. Those that are closer to larger cities have been more impacted, I think, from a healthcare standpoint than some of the more rural folks. Although the, rural folks may not have had maybe as many cases, or if any cases at all, they're still having a hard time finding PPE, having, infrastructure in their healthcare and their tribal clinics, and getting resources from the federal and state governments to make sure that they can manage those healthcare issues if and when they come up. So that's been a big issue. The biggest one I think we saw through March and April and even into May a little bit was the whole CARES Act funding. So we were fortunate to receive an $8 billion set aside from the federal government to go to tribal governments. But in a lot of cases, it was a giant mess. Nobody knew what was happening, when people were going to get money, if it was going to come, and what strings were attached to that. In a lot of ways, tribal governments are used to that, dealing with government grant programs and different things that are specific for tribes. But in this way, it was difficult because those dollars were specifically directed to, in some cases, COVID-related expenses. And, that of course is your sanitation, your PPE and things like that, which certainly needed and much appreciated. But the largest hit the Indian country saw was loss in revenue. We had to close down all of our casinos, which is the biggest revenue generating source for Indian tribes. And all of those dollars from casinos go straight into tribal programs. So they provide education, they provide healthcare for elders, they provide for police service, medical service, a lot of those basic needs for tribal members living on or near the reservation. And so in that case, it was really scary because people, tribes didn't know where to go or what was going to happen. So we spent months trying to help our clients navigate through those issues. I think you know, we're sort of coming out of that a little bit, but there's still a lot of unknowns. Folks have, some tribes have reopened their casinos and then, you know, as a result had some kind of COVID outbreak. Now they're back closed again. So it's just creating a lot of confusion and a lot of uncertainty. You know, right now is often the time that tribal governments are budgeting for the next year. And, you know, much like the state and the feds and all of, you know, many businesses as well, but how are they going to provide services for their people in 2021? And that's a big unknown that, you know, is still yet to be answered. So I think that's been the most difficult thing. I think as far as my practice goes, I primarily represent tribally owned businesses, non-casino businesses. So my hope is that the sort of the shining light through all of this COVID is that the, you know, tribal governments realize the importance of diversifying their economic portfolios. So when their casino shuts down, you know, they've got other types of businesses and a variety of industries that are ready and able to provide for the government and, you know, build that wealth for the citizens and for those services.
Sure. Yeah. Great. Bing, you're up next. I think you and I talked very early on, it seemed like, during the shutdowns. Maybe it was in early April or so. And, you know, you had some concerns about, you know, just the way small businesses were sort of being affected by some of the orders coming down from the state in particular. How have things changed over that time, maybe for you personally as a business owner, but as well as for some of the members, small business members in the Asian American community?
Well, Andy, thank you so much for putting this panel together and for MiBiz for investing in their time and resources to do this conversation. As I listened to the previous panelists and as I'm anticipating and looking forward to the comments made by Jeffrey, I think one of the things that I'm hearing about is that we have a lot of things in common. Yes, each one of us may represent a different ethnic or group, but as I listen to the stories, these stories are probably the same in the Asian American community as well. And I think that one of the things that COVID has shown to me and to the Asian American population here in West Michigan is that, you know, our constant invisibility and our constantly being ignored as a community tells us that we are going to have to be more visible, more loud, so to speak, and learn from each other and from others' history and stories, and then combine and collaborate together so that we can have an effective voice to make the necessary changes, to demand the necessary changes, so that all of us in this community can be enriched because we all bring significant contributions and values to each other's lives. So, you know, for me personally, in our conversation, Andy, in the beginning of the COVID crisis, the floral industry was also shut down, and it was shut down for about 2 months. And we worked hard to encourage the governor to allow the retail floral industry to at least be open to delivering flowers and you know, non-contact deliveries and pickups. We argued that if flowers can be sold in, you know, in the major supermarkets, then why can't flowers be sold by retail floral shops who are traditionally smaller shop owners? That has at least allowed for some of our smaller retail flower shops to hopefully be able to be in business after post-COVID, but that's still in question. As far as my other business is concerned, we are still shut down in terms of doing our wedding and conference center business. And that's been shut down since March, and we have not been successful in convincing the governor that we can do, if she would just allow us to have the same rules and regulations of a restaurant, 50% capacity, and all the CDC, you know, safety requirements, that we can do that, as you know, and we can do that, and we can maybe survive the pandemic crisis. But I'm not optimistic about that, because we're not getting any signals from their office that they were even willing to consider that.
Mhm.
The issue of the Asian Pacific American business community, and again, this is what I'm learning in the last few months, is that we need to learn, we meaning the Asian American community needs to learn more about what's happening in the Hispanic community, the African American community, the LGBTQ community, the Native American community, because we only know our story, but our story is so limited. And when we hear more about what the struggles and also what their solutions that they are pursuing in the other communities, I think that we can learn from them. So I think that, you know, the Asian American community stands to gain more by working with other communities, and that's one of the goals. I know that Guillermo and I have had several conversations. I have not had those conversations with Sandra, and I think that was something that impoverishes us as a Asian American community. We do need to have those conversations, especially with Tanya. I mean, we just don't know that much about the Native American community. I worked I was in a ministry position for about 7.5 years, and I worked with the Navajo Nation, so I'm somewhat familiar with that community, and it just pains me to hear the devastation that's going on, and our government's unwillingness to recognize that and to respond to that in a much more compassionate way than what has been shown presently. We're also really, what we're finding out in the Asian American community is that a lot of the challenges that we are facing is also caused by our silence, our invisibility. You know, we have to take some of that responsibility on our own shoulders as well. And so, you know, we've worked hard with Kent County in terms of the grant relief program for small businesses. We've worked hard with the Grand Rapids Chamber to work with that. I've worked with Guillermo and with Jamil Robinson on these issues as well. We have to have a more in-depth approach to helping our small business communities, especially those who are part of our minority business community, to be given the resources so that they can survive this pandemic. We're not out of the woods. And if it's talked about Kent County, in Kent County, the combined contributions of minority business revenues to the Kent County GDP exceeds over $800 million. And if you think about that, and if we're not serious about making sure that we provide every opportunity for these businesses to survive, just think what $800 million taken out of Kent County's budget will look like for Kent County and the quality of life of the people living in Kent County. It is that serious. And it is also, you know, something that can be preventable, but we need to have individuals around the table who can speak from experience about what needs to be done to ensure the sustainability of these ethnic communities that is really a strength and a richness that Kent County and West Michigan cannot afford to lose. So that for us as a Asian American population, we need to explain and tell our stories. One of the things that I know I've been doing some studies on this, I've been speaking on this in different meetings, is that within the Asian American community, the COVID crisis has impacted us to the point where the loss of employment is almost like 450% of our Asian American employees. That's probably as high or higher than any other groups, you know, that is part of our community and part of our nation. And yet we don't hear those statistics either. And so I think it's time for us to get together, and that's why I appreciate this this time together today, Andy and MiBiz, to hear each other's story and then come together and say, what can we do together to ensure that all of us, every resident of Kent County and West Michigan, can have a quality of life that we should deserve and we deserve to have. That's hopefully is the goal and the result of our conversation today.
Great.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Well, Jeffrey, that leaves you to, I guess, sort of share your experience. So, you know, the LGBTQ community has seen a couple of victories actually over the past few months, both at the Supreme Court level as well as in your backyard in Holland with a new LGBTQ non-discrimination ordinance that was passed. But just wondering if you can share, you know, some of the challenges or opportunities that Out on the Lakeshore has sort of seen over the past 6 months or so.
Yeah, so of course, like everyone else, our programming had to move virtual along with all of our resources. We had some things available on our website, but not all of our resources that if you walk in the door would be available. So one of the first things we had to do was basically consolidate all of the different resources that we had in paper form and make sure those were available online as well. Because a big thing that Out on the Lakeshore does is refer people to other nonprofit organizations or other agencies that can help with whatever it is they need. I am a staff of one, so of course that was a little bit more of a difficult situation to suddenly have to move an entire organization to the virtual setting. And that includes our programming that we do. Our capabilities weren't necessarily there to have several different people hosting virtual events. And so I became the host of many of our programs that normally we have a volunteer who runs. So even my time had to be distributed very differently than previously. But then we quickly saw that people are burnt out on Zoom, and I don't think it took very long for people to get that Zoom out either. So our programming even started to dwindle in numbers, and some programming we said it's just not feasible to do online, or we just don't have the capabilities to do it, so they were put on hold. Others, like I said, we saw those dwindling numbers, and we continue to see those numbers, so we're starting to figure out, well, how can we revamp some of our programming, do new things, whether it's virtual or small group settings. Even if we can figure out ways to do different programming outside before it starts getting too cold, but we're already into that colder season, and that's not going to be feasible much longer either. Like you said, we definitely had some victories. So as we were kind of going through the struggle of Pride festivals everywhere were being canceled, everywhere from the smaller festivals like the Holland Pride Festival that we host to, you know, the large like Chicago Pride and Grand Rapids Pride, you know, all of those bigger Pride festivals were being canceled everywhere. And for a small organization like Out on the Lakeshore, Pride is a major fundraiser for us. And we, of course, we're not seeing the possible income from that we normally would have seen. So we were trying to figure out, how do we revamp what Pride looks like and reimagine it to be more of a virtual setting. And we were able to do one in-person event and some virtual stuff as well, and work with other agencies within Michigan and across the country to at least be able to still celebrate Pride in a different way. But we didn't see the proceeds that we normally would have seen. So that was a struggle, but fortunately at that same time is when the Supreme Court passed their case, saying that they now recognize sex to define sexual orientation and gender identity. So as we're kind of going through a lot of struggles and people were, you know, disheartened by the fact that Pride festivals are canceled, suddenly we had this big win that I don't think a lot of people really expected to happen when it happened. It kind of caught a lot of people by surprise. So that was huge. But I think at the same time, it also made people want to celebrate more. And I think some people were even more discouraged that we can't really celebrate. Another thing within Holland specifically is COVID put on hold a process that we had already set in motion, working with Holland City Council to try to amend the non-discrimination ordinance. And everything was looking good. And the first meeting where they were going to discuss an actual proposed ordinance that had been drafted and was ready to go, that first meeting was the first council meeting that they had to cancel. And then they decided from that point on, it was, you know, essential meetings only and essential topics at those meetings, which means the ordinance was put on hold for a while, especially recognizing that Holland wanted the community involved and wanted to be able to provide, you know, the public comment and really have that dialogue versus just the council having the decision solely be from their conversations. So I think it was important to put it on hold, but it was also discouraging that we had to wait longer. You know, it's a long process to amend an ordinance, and we had already waited 9 years since the last time that discussion was brought up, and then we had to wait, you know, several more months because of COVID-19. Fortunately, when things started opening up a little bit again, we had those conversations with the council and were able to continue the public discussion of the ordinance. And that was approved just a few weeks ago. So of course, another huge win for the LGBTQ community in Holland and West Michigan. Granville just passed a similar ordinance just a few days ago. So, you know, we're seeing a lot of successes and wins within the LGBTQ community, even locally. But now we're at that point where we're trying to figure out, how do we move forward? Because we've seen these wins and, you know, we put a lot of effort into that ordinance, but we're no longer in a point where we need to focus on that. And it's now to the point where we need to focus on how do we continue to help the community, because our big focus of the last almost year is no longer necessary because it passed. One thing that I will say that we've seen an uptick in during this time is people who have lost their jobs and are reaching out to us to say, you know, what are some recommendations on where I can apply for a job? One difficulty with that is a lot of the places we normally would recommend, because they're places that we've partnered with in the past, or we know that they have a strong DEI department and have a good reputation within the DEI world. A lot of those companies have gone through their own layoffs and they aren't necessarily hiring a lot of people right now. So we're also seeing that struggle of not really knowing how to help some people, because we're in such a weird time right now where some of the recommendations we normally would have given, we can't really give at this time.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's a good segue into my next question was, you know, over the last several months, we've seen a lot of commitments to DEI among companies, and, you know, ensuring that that's sort of a long-term commitment or a goal of the company, you know, I think is going to, you know, have to be, you know, essentially putting words into action, and, you know, that's hiring practices, but, you know, there's also, you know, a role that banks and that the government plays as well in sort of ensuring this long-term sort of DEI commitment. And so, you know, I'm wondering, Sandra, maybe I'll start with you. You know, how companies can sort of, I guess, what companies can sort of do to ensure these longer term commitments to hiring people hiring minorities, or essentially going beyond statements that come out, and sort of making that long term.
Our hiring pools that is taking place within these companies and colleges and universities, where I serve on boards. I mean, those are constant conversations. So it has to start from there. But I firmly believe it has to be modeled from the leadership. And within so many companies in, I won't just say West Michigan, but even in the state, you do not see where there's diverse leadership teams. I don't want to point out specifically companies here in West Michigan, because there are some that are doing it very well and have made a commitment to not only model this within their leadership team, but in their second and third level management and leadership teams as well. So that's very, very important. And something that we're always advocating for here at Women's Resource Center is fair pay. And we see, we're constantly seeing that over and over again. We're talking about that we have fair pay day every single day for women of color, for Black women. And until women are paid at the same range, and COVID just added, another level to this. You have so many women that have been out of work and have lost work. So now they're going to even have even more years to catch up to get fair wages. And so I think that there's things that companies can do, leadership can do, and their HR departments can do to ensure that they are looking at every one of their team members and ensuring that women are being paid at the same level as men are. And we see that with Black and Latina women and Native American women in particular. We are the three groups that are paid lower than any other woman. And that has got to stop.
Sure. Guillermo, do you want to sort of take the question on sort of access to capital, and, particularly, during COVID, as well as, the government's response with relief loans and grants, long term, how can, the Hispanic community, for example, sort of maintain or gain better access to capital to sort of ensure longer term success for businesses, and I'm assuming some of your members as well.
Yeah, definitely, Andy. So, I firmly believe that there should be a more intentional, partnership with grassroots organizations, that have direct relationships, with our neighborhoods and our communities of color, to be able to reach out, to the companies, in this case, Latinx, businesses. Supporting and empowering grassroots organizations will allow the government, to reach further, and really get, to the corners, of the community that are, normally left, untouched, we continue to see Anglo organizations that continue to collect money, to do work on behalf, or for communities of color, and they don't have the social networks, the social capital. They are not known within, the neighborhood, within our communities of color. So obviously, the reach, is very limited. So what we continue to share with our government, at the state, and local, level is that, how can you partner, with us, with the West Michigan Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, with the Hispanic Center of Western Michigan, with the Women's Resource Center, with all of the organizations of color that are doing the work, within the community, with the Urban League, that's, that's a very important piece of the conversation, because, if we continue to provide the financial resources, to the same organizations, nothing is going to change. And we are seeing it, we haven't seen this impact. In the case of the Latinx, community, we have been here for 100 years. Those are the statistics we have. The first Latinos moved to the Granville Avenue at the beginning of the 1900s to work in manufacturing and agriculture. It is embarrassing that after 100 years of the Latino community being here in West Michigan, we don't have the resources, we don't have access to capital. Again, I think, as we continue to move forward, better relationships should be developed, between government, between other Anglo organizations and grassroots organizations and organizations of color, led by people of color. So that's one piece. The other piece, Andy, is also that, I won't blame, all of the banks, about the lack of access to capital. When I started in my position, it's going to be almost 4 years ago, I started to meet with bankers, with different, partners of the Hispanic Chamber, with presidents, vice presidents, and through conversations, I remember this, this president of one of the banks that it's a partner of ours, he was telling me, Guillermo, it's not that we don't want to lend money to your community. Is that your community is not prepared to receive, the resources. They don't have financial statements. They don't show, when we ask for the IRS, returns, the businesses in the Latino community don't show, any revenue, so, I mean, that's the business one. We can't, lend money to a business that is not, viable. And in that moment, someone hit me, and I thought, well, of course not. Of course, you won't lend money to my community because my community is not prepared, to receive the money. So I started to meet with Latinx business owners, and that was the case. A high percentage of Latinx businesses don't even own bank accounts. We have a cash-based economy within our Latinx community. So many of these business owners that become successful buy real estate, they own 20, 30 houses that they rented out, but they don't have, a bank account. They don't have a credit history. So if you don't have a credit history, you can ask for money, to expand your business. So that's one piece. There are no processes and systems in place in my Latino community. Many of these businesses don't have bookkeeping, don't have financial statements to present, and we saw this issue when the SBA, through the Small Business Development Center, started to, with the PP, with the SBA loans, at the very beginning of COVID, that none of the businesses, from the Latino community had their things together, so in regards to financial statements. So that's a serious issue that we're tackling, at the Hispanic Chamber. During COVID, after a year and a half of conversations, planning, about this project, I received a grant from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation to put in place an accounting initiative that we are going to start in the next, few weeks. We're going to be supervised by a large CPA firm in Grand Rapids, but the Hispanic Chamber is hiring 2 accountant professionals to be able to provide the financial structure, to every Latino business that wants to have accounting or bookkeeping. So that's in place. We are just in the process of hiring these 2 professionals. We're going to charge below market rates, the Hispanic Chamber, and this is going to be a service that we're going to be, implementing in my deadline it was beginning of October, but I'm finalizing the recruiting of these professionals, and I would hope I can start by mid-October on this. So anyway, it's both sides. We need more partnerships that come to our organizations of color, to our community, but also my community, specifically the Latinx business community, needs to be prepared to receive the funds and to have access to capital.
Sure. Yeah. And Tanya, you mentioned this earlier as well about, the need for tribes to diversify as sort of a lesson learned. How would you sort of, characterize, the federal government's response, through the CARES Act or through lending programs? And, is that something, the tribal community or tribal governments, could rely on in the future, or see greater partnerships in terms of being able to get financial relief or something like loans in the future?
Yeah, it's not enough. I mean, the CARES Act was helpful. The PPP loan program that Guillermo mentioned was helpful and certainly used by tribal businesses as long as they met the criteria. But it's never enough. I mean, the federal government, certainly I could go on for days about how they fail to adhere to their trust responsibilities, sovereign nations all over this country. And they've created a handful of programs that tribes do benefit from and have been useful in the past. They've got a BIA loan guarantee program, for example, where you can go finance a real estate development or some business, and the BIA will back it 90% so long as it's owned by an Indian tribe. And there are some other environmental programs and different things that are helpful, but it's never enough. And I think the lack of capital, as Guillermo mentioned, is also a huge problem from Indian country, whether that's tribally owned businesses or individual natives trying to open their business. But I spend a significant amount of my time arguing with banks, literally all the time, because we don't fit into their box and we don't fit in a form nicely. So I can really respect Guillermo's comments about how maybe his community wasn't prepared, and there's probably some truth to that, and it sounds like good steps that he's taking to get his community prepared. And I think we've done similar things on the tribal side as far as getting tribal members educated on business and accounting and things like that. But the other problem is we need to educate banks and their leadership and private equity firms and anybody else who can be a source of capital about our community. And that is a real battle. I won't name any names, but there's certainly a bank that I've been working with for the last couple of years, and they had a real interest in lending to Indian country, to non-casino businesses, but couldn't figure out how to do it. And the real problem is that a tribal economic development company doesn't fit into that box. They don't, the bank can't take a mortgage, let's say, on a building that's on trust land. And so how do we get the bank comfortable that the tribe or the tribal company has, enough financial resources, have assets that they can collateralize, in the event of default? How do we get them comfortable? And so, a lot of my job is thinking outside of the box and trying to get some understanding from the banks of the world on how to do business in Indian country. And especially, I think, for tribes, and I'm sure some of you have similar experiences, but there are 576, I think, federally recognized tribes across the United States, and not a single one of them are the same. And so anytime a bank comes to me and says, well, you have to fill out this form, or you have to do it this way, or you have to agree to this language because some other tribe in California said it was okay, that's not acceptable. We're different, and we want, we need you, bank, to understand that we're different. And I'm always happy to explain it and take the time to, educate others and make them comfortable. But for us, it's really a relationship oriented too. And so sometimes it takes years to get, one bank willing to feel like, wow, now we understand your tribe, this one out of 500 and some tribes, we get you. And now we feel comfortable that we can lend you guys a couple of bucks, but, how do they get comfortable to lend to the next tribe or the next tribally owned company? So certainly access to capital is something that we talk about on a very regular basis. It's not easy to get there sometimes, but I'd certainly be happy to brainstorm with you, Guillermo, on some of the things we've done in Indian country that, you know, maybe might be similarly effective for the Hispanic Chamber and anybody else.
Thank you, Tanya. I would appreciate that very much.
Great. Bing, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add on sort of the, you know, this financing and capital aspect of it?
Yeah, I think I've learned a lot, right, just listening, you know, to the comments already. Sandra talked a little bit more about the diversity within the workforce challenges that's being faced. And, you know, Guillermo and Tanya talked about the access to capital. I'll take a different approach than they are. I think that it is not our job to educate the bankers. I think it's their job to do their job well. And I think that, and you know, this is the phrase that I use a lot that I've heard from other people is that culture eats policy for lunch. And as long as the culture in the banking institutions or any work companies or anything like that, you know, is one that because of their lack of knowledge of other cultures, and because all they know in terms of the HR department or management department is make assumptions about other ethnic communities based on their just sound bites that they may have heard because they've never interacted in any in depth with anyone within other cultures other than where they belong. It doesn't matter to me if the CEO says, I'm committed to this. Because the culture in the workplace will determine whether or not that talent that comes from another group, ethnic community, will stay or not stay, or even accept the job. Because that's the challenge that we are facing in West Michigan. The retention of international talent from all walks of life, different countries in the world, that's the challenge that we're facing. The economy that we are facing in the state of Michigan and even in West Michigan, let's just stay close to home. The talent that we are needing to sustain our growing economy is going to require talent that comes from other countries, other ethnic groups. And until those organizations and those businesses change the culture within their workplace, we will not retain those talents. And so therefore, I think that, you know, the banks ought to learn the simple statistics, right? Right now, we can look at all the statistics. Where is the growth of the discretionary income in West Michigan and the United States? Where is that growth going? It's not in the traditional majority community. It's in the non-white, in the minority communities, where the trajectory of economic growth and discretionary income is growing. And at some point in time, we're going to see a shifting of that balance of power in our country and in our state. And it's already moving in that direction in our city of Grand Rapids. So we have to start, you know, I don't want any ethnic community to sit there and take and just assume that we're not ready. We're ready, but maybe you're not ready to understand how we do things as well. And we have value in how we do things as well. So I want to at least challenge that premise that, well, you know, Guillermo, your Latinx community is not ready to receive adults. BS. If we're not ready and we are a viable group to make you money as a bank, why are you not investing your resources to learn more about our communities? I think it's just, again, it's the shifting of blame to the people who really shouldn't be blamed. Mm-hmm. Sure, we can certainly do better ourselves. You know, the programs that Time talks about, Guillermo, Sandra, and I'm sure Jeffrey's doing the same thing with the community that he's leading. We're doing the same thing with our Asian American community. But again, at some point in time, those who are controlling the systems right now need to take responsibility and need to know that not taking that responsibility also has will have a negative impact on their organization. So, so access to capital is certainly a challenge, but that has been a challenge all the time. And I can tell you my own horror stories of where a local bank, wanted to charge me 80% down payment or equity before they would give me a loan, when other banks would give me 20%, 20% down. And then this same bank gave a loan commitment letter to a white person for the same project I was bidding on for 20%. So I'm just saying, and this is not 1960 or 70. This was in the year 2001. So I'm just saying that in order for us to have a strong, diverse workforce, businesses and companies better understand that their culture has to also change, so that it values and gives credibility and credit to people who don't look like their traditional workforce. Access to capital. If you are a bank or a financial institution and you're going to make money off people by loaning people money, don't ignore the fastest growing communities that are not part of your traditional customer base, because they will become your traditional customer base in the future. And if you treat them like that now, then you will not have a business in the future either. And we should not accept that kind of, well, you know what, you're not ready for it. I'm sorry, we are ready. I think maybe you're not ready, and you don't care if you don't give us the access to the capital that will eventually allow you to stay in business. Sorry for the rant, but I think I'm tired of always having the blame placed on the people that really have no control over their systems.
And I actually agree with you. I mean, I spent 15 years, as you know, in the banking industry, and it was directly my responsibility. It was directly the banks, and some banks do it better than others. But I think as a whole, banks as a whole have lost their way, especially some of them who were doing it really, who had some really foundational work in cultural diversity and really working to infiltrate markets. I will tell you, I completely agree with what you said, and it is not the responsibility of community members to learn how to do this. A bank should be actively in communities, helping communities learn, helping businesses learn how to get into their markets, get into their accounts, and that's their fault, not any of our faults.
And I agree.
I'm sorry, once they start that, there will be another excuse behind that. Sorry, Guillermo, go ahead.
No, and there are several, components, to this issue. Starting with understanding a financial system that we have in the country. That it's different to other financial systems. I respect, what you mentioned, being, and we have a lot of work to do. I think in both sides, because, in order to be successful, one of the things that I'm advocating for is exactly what Sandra just mentioned: knowledge, tools. How are you investing, your resources in our communities of color? If we give $500,000 loan to a small grocery store, Latino grocery store, and the business owner doesn't know how to manage that $500,000, and suddenly buys a new house, buys 2 Suburbans 2020 instead of investing in the business, that it has to be on both sides. And we are seeing, and I'm sharing by experience, because we have a lot of businesses within our Latino community that have received loans, but they don't know how to manage. And now they are in debt, huge debts, you know, we have this business that owes over $1 million to one single bank, you know. So is the responsibility, you know, of the banks, you know, to make sure that when they lend the money will be paid back. But also our community needs to make sure that they are, you know, they steward, you know, the financial resources in the right way. So it has to be a combination, you know, of you know, and there are several factors, and I you know, I have a lot of, you know, components to this, at least within the Latino community. But you know, the conclusion or the summary for me is that we have a lot of work to do in this community.
At least your company that you are referring to received a loan. We're talking about even getting access to a loan. And I think that's a different process. And so if that company received $1 million loan, which means they showed already the financial strength according to, and Sandra, correct me if I'm wrong, but the bank also has certain standards that they have to meet in order to lend those loans, because they are also controlled by federal guidelines, correct? So that company already has $1 million loan, and good for them. And what they don't, we got to give them credit because they met the standards required by the bank to give them that loan. How they manage that loan from that on is a different question in my mind. And I think the chambers do have a responsibility or have the resources available to help that business do that well. But we're talking about getting even to first base, getting to get that loan approved. How do we get that done when you know, when we have you know, institutions that may not understand and may not give the value and of that investment in that community, because everything that we do is what do we get for the return on our investments, and I think that's where I'm struggling with when I see a lot of folks, and I've had to go through all this stuff myself, so you know, it's not like it's foreign to me, and not like I'm talking about it in a vacuum. I've heard it from other fellow entrepreneurs who are struggling to make it work. That's why organizations like the Roundtable Progress Capital is a major tool that's been made available in recent years, so they're only less than 2 years old. So I think I'm talking about access to capital. I think the institutions, the financial institutions, they also need to step in. I mean, Kellogg Foundation, good for them. I mean, we're so grateful that they're around to help process some of these things. But why are the banks not making that investments? Because in some ways, they're going to get a return on that investment, right? They're going to get a return on that investment. And just think about this. If a bank would just invest in some of these folks, who knows whether or not they're going to invest in the next Jerry Yang, who is the founder of Yahoo, right? Who knows if all these things are possible. And so I think the culture, the institutional systems, just right now seems like it isn't valuing the ability and the contributions that non-traditional businesses can bring to the financial institutions. And I think it's time for them to also invest in that opportunity and partner along with all of the folks that are on this panel and others who are in our community.
Mm-hmm.
That's
think
exactly
that
we need investment.
That resistance almost, is that unique to West Michigan, or are there particular weaknesses here in West Michigan?
At least the way I'm looking at it from now is that it's just that we don't have enough people in decision-making positions who understand the history. They don't understand, and they are part of the traditional history. So, for example, I don't know if it makes any sense, but in 1944, okay, in 1944, the U.S. Supreme Court said that the denial of civil liberties based on national identity and race and ethnicity is legal. 1944. So how many of those lessons have been continuing to move forward? What have we taught about that? Now, it has been rescinded, I understand that, but it's been there. And so it's the culture, it is the lack of information or knowledge about the different ethnic communities that prevents people who are in decision-making positions to make the correct decisions. For myself personally, I am, I'm learning more about the other communities, and I've been involved with other communities, but I think that maybe the people in those positions need to be more aware of and knowledgeable about these different communities. And that's why I say culture eats policy for lunch. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to start standing up and say, why are you thinking that way? Why are you, not to big into a confrontational, divisive kind of conversation, but to have a real conversation around the table. Did you know about this? Did you know about that? Do you know about how the Native American communities work? I was doing a teleconference seminar with a group of of a federal agency, and they said, did you know how the Native American community make their decisions, right? And I don't know that much about them, but Tanya can help me maybe and help us understand it. But my understanding is, for them, their decision making is not about today; it's about 7 generations from now, right? Can you think about that? Think what we can learn from that, value that they put into their culture. That we listen, that we think about our decision making, not about what impact it has currently, but what impact will that have 7 generations from now? Mm-hmm. Sure. These are the kinds of things, and I'm sure there are values and principles that are within the Hispanic, Latino community, the African American community, the Asian American community, the LGBTQ community, and other communities, that if we learn more about them, then our decision makers can make better decisions. And I don't know if that's only common, if that's a common problem, or if that's just a problem within our own community. I'm assuming that it's probably a problem that may be faced in other communities as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time here. This has been a really good discussion, but I'd want to sort of wrap up by either, asking if you have any concluding thoughts you'd like to add, or I'll just pose this, based on what we've learned over the past 6 months and what your organizations have learned over the past 6 months, there's still quite a bit of uncertainty ahead, whether it's the pandemic itself and what's going to happen on the public health front, what may happen, politically with the election coming up, with uncertainty over additional relief from the government to help businesses through this. I'm just wondering what your concerns are going into, maybe we can think of it as sort of a new phase of the pandemic, but just what your concerns are coming up here. So I guess we'll circle back and go alphabetically again, but start with Jeffrey this time.
Yeah, so I'd say one of my biggest concerns is, again, that access to financial stability, especially because, kind of like what Tanya was saying about the different Native American communities, in my case, all nonprofits are also different, and even the PPP loans are not necessarily designed for all nonprofits even to be able to do it. Out on the Lakeshore didn't qualify, and I think a big part of that is because we're such a new organization. We're only about 4 years old. The way we function isn't quite the same as really what those loans were designed for, and really they weren't designed for nonprofits. Nonprofits were eligible, but you had to fit kind of a cookie cutter mold that out on the Lakeshore unfortunately didn't qualify for. And I'm sure there's several other nonprofits that were in roughly the same boat. And the reason why that's a big concern to me is that so many of the minority groups the resources that are helping them are nonprofits. So if a nonprofit can't afford to continue to operate, that's that many less resources available to the LGBTQ community, people of color, women. So to me, that's a big concern. Out on the Lakeshore isn't really struggling right now, but I know there are nonprofits that have closed their doors, and it's disheartening that those are resources that are either no longer available, or it's that much more work put on, a neighboring nonprofit to make sure that the community is still taken care of.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Great. Bing, any parting thoughts or concerns for the months ahead?
Well, I've taken enough of your time, so let me just end by saying this thing. Asian American issues is an American issue. And we ought to deal with this collectively in order for all of us to be able to live out a quality of life that will be passed on to our children and not to our grandchildren.
All right, great. Tanya?
Yeah, I'll echo that. I don't know what my specific concerns are, but I think my hope is that, through COVID and through a lot of the social justice and change that we're seeing, I hope this continues. I think this is a really good opportunity for, tribes and everybody else to take a look and see why did COVID have such an impact on us, and what can we do different in the future to limit that impact, and how do we work together? Certainly in the social justice department, I think all of us here on this panel have something to say, and a community of folks behind us that we need to band together and to continue to raise our voices and continue to push for that change. And I think that's the only way, we're all successful.
Sandra, what's your outlook like?
Well, we are just continuing to focus on women who are having not only the burden of caring for their children, but also just trying to find work. But we are also really concerned about the mental and health needs of women during this pandemic. That's critically important, as well as domestic violence. We have continued to refer to partner agencies and just ask that community members just be aware and continue to look out for that. But I think for everyone, and for our young people, that mental and physical health is just so critical for us to make sure that we are aware of our own loved ones, but our staff members and our team members, and the populations that we're serving.
Great. Guillermo?
Yeah, my biggest concern right now it's the economy. How when this economy will reopen. A high percentage of Latinx businesses have disappeared. Because they were struggling to begin with. And some of the ones that were doing good. Now it has been affected. A high number of individuals. Many of the individuals from the Latino community were employed by these businesses. So that's my biggest concern. When the economy will reopen, and how we're going to be able to make sure that we're going to be safe. We are working with MIOSHA and the state in bringing in-person trainings for some of these businesses to reopen safely. But it's I don't know if when this finally reopens, if it's going to be too late for my business community. That's my biggest concern right now.
All right, great. Well, once again, thank you to all of you for taking the time today to have this discussion. I think it's been a really valuable discussion, and wish the best of you, wish the best of luck to each of you in your organizations going forward. So thanks again and take care.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Yeah.
everyone.
Thank you.